Wacky Jigheading for when it gets wacky tough.
Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli here. I want to talk to you about my absolute favorite finesse technique when things go south, when things get tough and the fish aren't biting. It's the Wacky Jighead. And this thing has bailed me out of tough situations so many times over the years, and it's actually won a few events for me. I want to talk to you about my basic setup and how I fish this lure. You know, the first thing, the most important, is the jig head. And you know, a wacky jig head is really the key to the movement. And this is the VMC Ike approved wacky jig head. And if you look at it, we've got just a ball, a weight that's right below the eye of the hook. And that's the setup you want. You know, the other great thing about the VMC Wacky Jig Head is that we've got a really nice light wire guard on there. And you know, for me in open water, I'll just take my nips and I actually just cut that guard off. In situations like we have here with grass and cover and wood and fishing around docks, I'll leave that little wire guard on there and that'll keep it from getting snagged a lot. You know, the next component is the bait. And to me, a wacky jig head is at its best when you're using a bait that doesn't have a lot of big action to it. So for straight tail finesse worm, straight tail 6 or 7 inch worm, and especially soft stick baits. It's a premier way to fish a soft stick bait. This is a Berkeley Havoc flat dog, and you know, I'll just rig this thing just like you would a traditional wacky rig, and I'm gonna go right in the middle of the bait. You know, one of the things about a wacky jig head versus a weightless wacky is the amount of water you can cover. For you guys at home that fish a weightless wacky, you know how long it could take you to fish through an area. You've got to make that cast, let the bait settle down, slowly fish it. Takes a lot of time. The nice thing about the wacky jig head is that you can cover a lot of water. I can cover twice as much water because it's a weighted bait and I've got a little more control of that bait. You know, the other thing a wacky jig head does versus a weightless wacky, it accentuates the action of the bait. If you can imagine, you know, it's kind of like a ball and chain. You know, on this VMC jig head, that ball of weight right there is pulling down. And as it pulls down, the chain, which is your soft plastic on the back, activates and has more action than if you would fish it weightless. Rod and reel, you know, this is truly a finesse technique, and I like spinning equipment. I'll use from a 6'10" up to about a 7.5 foot spinning rod, and go with a medium action. You want a lighter action rod. You know, reel, a 20 or 30 size spinning reel is perfect for the situation. And then line, and in line choice, I'm going to go with either straight fluorocarbon, which we have here, 6 or 8 pound straight fluorocarbon, or light braid to a fluorocarbon leader. You know, to really let this bait get maximum action, straight fluorocarbon is a phenomenal way to fish it. I'm going to jump up front and show you how I fish this wacky jig head. You know, the other great thing about the wacky jig head technique is that it's good for all anglers. You don't have to be in a $50,000 bass boat. If you're a kayak guy, a john boat guy, a canoe guy, if you're fishing off the bank, this is the perfect bait. It's versatile, it's weedless, it's finesse, and in any of those scenarios, this is the kind of bait that's going to catch a fish. You know, we're in a pocket here and we're fishing little grass points. So when I make that cast, I want to make sure I always cast past the target. You know, I'm going to make that cast over toward that object, and when I get to that grass point, and this is the most important thing when you're wacky jig heading, is letting that bait fall on a semi-slack line. You know, here's a good way to show you. You know, if you let that bait fall on a tight line, what happens is that bait will pendulum away from the cover in a very unnatural fashion. If you make that cast and you let it fall on totally slack line, you lose contact to your bait. A lot of times the fish will bite it and spit it out. But the correct way to fish it is to fish it on a semi-slack line. And all that means is that when you cast, you want to have controlled slack or a slight bow in your line. And you're watching it as it falls. And when you let it fall with semi-slack or slight bow, it's gonna fall straight down next to that object, that cover target, and it's gonna have that maximum action. So always let it fall on a semi-slack line. So I'm gonna make that cast, past that weed point. I'm gonna let it fall on a semi-slack line. The entire time I'm watching that bow as the bait falls. Boom, there it goes. The line just bellowed out. That means it's hit the bottom. Once it hits the bottom, I'm basically gonna get my rod from 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock and I'm gonna tip it up. And when you tip it up, you're reactivating the Wacky Jighead, that bait on the rise. So I'm gonna tip it up, and then after I'm done, I follow it back down with semi-slack line. So I'm following it back down, 12 to 3, boom, hits the bottom, tipping it up, following it back down. And I'm gonna do that all the way back to the boat, or when I feel like I'm out of the zone of the fish, I'm gonna reel it in and I'm gonna make my cast. You know, remember, the great thing about a Wacky Jighead, unlike a weightless jig head, is you can cover a tremendous amount of water, it improves the action of the bait, and it's perfect for tough fishing conditions. Try these tips when things get tough. I bet you're gonna catch a couple.